They said everything had a price, and Richard Hale believed it. He paid $200,000 for a Mustang no one could tame, convinced that wealth could bend even the wildest spirit. But when every man failed, it wasn't the ropes or the whips that changed the beast. It was the quiet hands of a boy no one noticed. A boy who would risk everything to protect a freedom money could never buy. The late afternoon sun poured down over the Texas plains, a molten orange light settling across the land like a burning veil. Dust hung in the air around Hale Ranch, stirred by the restless hooves of a black Mustang pacing within a steel corral. The animal's coat shimmered like polished obsidian under the light, its mane wild, eyes flashing with something that was not simply fear, but fury. This was Shadow, the horse Richard Hale had spent a fortune to bring here, and the same horse no one could tame. Richard stood near the fence, his tailored white shirt sticking to his back with sweat despite the dry breeze. He was a man used to having the world bend beneath his will. In Houston, where his skyscrapers pierced the skyline, his name commanded respect. Out here, in his sprawling ranch on the edge of the Guadalupe Mountains, he liked to think of himself as a modern king of the wild, but today, the king looked more like a frustrated gambler who had placed his bet on the wrong card. "Careful, boss!" one of the ranch hands shouted as Shadow reared up on his hind legs, front hooves slicing the air like blades. The horse let out a cry that echoed across the wide valley, a sound so raw that even the men holding lassos hesitated. "He's not going to let anyone on his back." Richard's jaw tightened. He gripped the silver buckle of his belt and forced a laugh, though his eyes betrayed his growing impatience. "Every horse has a price, and every beast breaks," he said flatly, more to himself than to the men. But even as the words left his lips, Shadow lunged at the corral's bars, the metallic clang reverberating like a warning bell. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had tried for days. Bruised ribs, near-broken wrists, boots ripped open by flying hooves. It was as if the Mustang carried the desert storm inside his chest. They had given him the name Shadow, because when he moved, he was nothing but a blur, darkness with teeth and muscle. One of the older wranglers spat into the dirt and muttered, "Some horses ain't meant to be owned." His words earned him a sharp glare from Richard. "Don't start with that folklore nonsense," Richard snapped. "I didn't pay $200,000 at that auction for nothing. That horse is going to make me the talk of the South when I ride him in front of every man who ever doubted me." Still, as the dust settled around the corral, Richard felt a flicker of doubt. The image of him at his upcoming gala, mounted on the wild Mustang, conquering it with ease, impressing senators, oil men, and old rivals, had been so vivid when he signed the check. But now the horse stood before him, untouchable, defiant, as though mocking the very idea. At the edge of the ranch yard, hidden behind a stack of hay bales, a pair of young eyes watched silently. Ethan Miller crouched low, careful not to be seen. The boy's skinny arms were wrapped around his knees, his face smeared with dust from the day's chores. At 12, he had already learned how to make himself invisible around powerful men. His mother had told him never to bother Mr. Hale or his workers, to keep to the kitchen where she cooked. But Ethan couldn't help it. Ever since Shadow had been brought to the ranch, something about the horse had pulled at him like a magnet. Now, peering between the bales, he felt his chest tighten. He could sense what others couldn't see. The panic in Shadow's rolling eyes, the flinch beneath the muscle every time a rope whistled through the air. This wasn't rage for the sake of rage. This was pain, old wounds buried deep. The men tried again, stepping into the corral with lassos and poles. Dust exploded beneath Shadow's hooves as he charged, sending them scattering like leaves in a storm. One man cursed, barely dodging a kick that could have shattered his ribs. The horse's cry split the air once more, echoing into the hills. Ethan pressed his palms to his ears, but his eyes never left the black Mustang. It was as if the sound carried words only he could understand. I won't bow. I won't belong to them. Richard finally raised a hand, signaling to stop. His voice was cold, controlled, the kind that ended arguments without the need for shouting. Enough for today. Lock him back in the stalls. Let him stew until he remembers who owns him. Two workers hesitated, ropes dangling uselessly in their hands, but obeyed. It took all four of them to guide Shadow back into the stall, the horse snapping and striking even as the heavy wooden door slammed shut. Only when the final bolt clanged into place did the men allow themselves to breathe again. Richard lingered a moment longer, staring at the dark figure shifting restlessly inside the shadows of the stall. He thought of the check he had signed, the headlines he had imagined, and felt the bitter taste of disappointment rise like bile. You'll bend, he muttered under his breath. They all do. Then he turned, his boots crunching against the gravel, as he walked back toward the grand house that loomed like a fortress at the heart of the ranch. From his hiding place, Ethan slowly rose to his feet. His heart hammered in his chest, not just from the thrill of spying, but from something deeper, an ache of recognition. Shadow wasn't just another horse. He was a mirror. Ethan knew the feeling of being caged, of not belonging. He knew the sting of being overlooked, dismissed as the cook's boy. The boy's gaze lingered on the stall where Shadow was locked away. The dark, shape barely visible behind the bars. A whisper slipped from Ethan's lips, too soft for anyone else to hear. You don't belong to them, and neither do I. The wind swept across the plains then, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and mesquite, the cry of a hawk circling high above. For a moment, it felt as though the land itself had heard the boy's promise. In the fading light, Shadow pawed at the ground, restless. Behind the bars of the stall and the walls of the grand ranch house, two worlds were about to collide, one forged in wealth and pride, the other in quiet defiance. And in between them stood a boy who had nothing, except for the one gift that might change everything, the ability to listen to what no one else could hear. Morning at Hale Ranch began with the soft clatter of pans and the perfume of coffee drifting down the breezeway like a promise. Ethan Miller was already in the kitchen before dawn, sleeves rolled past his elbows, rinsing cilantro and cracking eggs into a steel bowl. His mother, Nora, moved with the quick efficiency of someone who'd learned to do 3 things at once to keep a living. She had the kind of smile that could make men forget the ache in their shoulders, and a way of touching Ethan's hair, quick and gentle, as if to apologize for how hard the world could be. Don't let Mr. Hale catch you staring at that horse, she warned, sliding a tray of biscuits into the oven. He doesn't like anyone near Shadow. Least of all, my boy. I wasn't staring, Ethan lied, eyes down. I was just looking. Nora glanced at him, reading what he didn't say. She set a hand on his cheek, warm from the stove. You're different, I know. You've always heard things other people can't. But some people don't like what they don't understand. She paused, then softened. Eat first. Then run the scraps to the dogs. You can help Sam with hay after. The name tightened Ethan's shoulders. Sam Rodriguez, the barn manager, was a tall man whose voice could turn the air sharp. He wore his hat low and his belt tight, and he handled rope as if it were a sentence. He liked order and speed, the kind that snapped. Sam had once told Ethan, without looking up, that boys who shy away from noise don't last long on a ranch. Ethan hadn't answered. He had learned a long time ago that silence could be armor. By the time the sun cracked open the horizon, the yard was awake. Pickup trucks idled out near the pens. Men laughed too loudly. Dogs skittered between boots. Dust rose like breath from the ground. Ethan carried a bucket of scraps to the kennels, where the ranch dogs, old strays that had learned their place, thumped their tails low. One of them, a red-nosed mutt he called Copper, stood back from the others and let the pushier dogs grab first. Copper had a notch missing from his ear and eyes that remembered hunger too well. "Hey, buddy," Ethan murmured, shooing the others with a gentle elbow. He knelt, held the bucket steady. Copper ate without growling. The dog's body trembled with leftover fear, as if it could never quite believe good things lasted. Ethan closed his eyes for a second and listened, not with his ears exactly, with something else. The space between them settled. When he finished, he detoured past the chicken run, where a proud, battered rooster strutted with a limp. Ethan shook a handful of feed and watched as the rooster pretended not to be grateful. "You again," Ethan teased, "still the boss of everybody." He fed the horses in the outer pastures next, careful with the mares heavy with foal. He knew which ones liked to be touched on the cheek and which preferred him to keep a respectful distance. He hummed as he worked, for no one but them. Farther off, the main barn stood like a ship run aground, its shadow cool against the morning. Inside, metal and leather made their quiet music, a chain clink, a saddle creak. Ethan stacked bales, the twine biting his palms. Sam's voice came from the aisle, clipped enough to cut. "Miller, you keep that pace. Winter will be here before you finish." Sam paused near him, eyes moving like a measuring tape. "You hear about the boss's party? Senators, oil money, cameras. He wants that black demon under a saddle by then. Means everybody does their job. No excuses." "Yes, sir," Ethan said. Sam's gaze slid toward the end stall, where heavy boards had been added, bolts cranked down hard. Even from here, Ethan felt it, like heat through a wall. The awareness of a living thing pacing, coiled tight. Shadow. The name fit for once. A darkness that moved. Sam smirked. "You keep out of that one. Boss doesn't want him spooked by soft hands and whispers." Ethan swallowed a reply. He turned back to the hay and lifted. The day stretched itself across the land, hot and bright. Flies wrote lazy letters in the air. By noon, Richard Hale swept through the barn in a pressed shirt and polished boots, a splash of city inside all that grit. He spoke with Sam in low tones, glancing at the locked stall as if it owed him back a part of himself. 3 days, Richard said finally. "Make progress, or I'll pay someone who can." "I'll handle it," Sam answered. Ethan kept his head down until their footsteps faded. Then he drifted to the far end of the barn, pretending to coil ropes. Through a narrow gap in the boards, he saw the horse's flank move, smooth as a river rock, slick with sweat. Shadow stood with his head angled toward the light, as if considering it, then turned away. His ears flicked at Ethan's soft breath. For a heartbeat, The world hushed. Years earlier, when Ethan was small enough to be mistaken for a bundle of laundry, Nora had found him in the alley behind their old apartment, crouched beside a wounded hawk. Its wing hung wrong. Its eye burned steady. Neighbors had muttered about rabies and sticks. Ethan had knelt in the oil slick dust and whispered. The hawk hadn't flown, not then, but it had stopped tearing at itself. It had let him touch the good wing. Just once. A test. 2 days later, with a splint fashioned from popsicle sticks and gauze borrowed from a church, it had taken the air again. He'd never told anybody how, exactly. It felt like saying it out loud would make it a lie. Staring into Shadow's stall, he felt the same feeling rise. A thread pulling. He wasn't brave. He wasn't reckless. He just couldn't pretend not to see. After lunch, the ranch softened into heat shimmer and the occasional clank of a gate. Grace Hale crossed the yard with a camera slung around her shoulder and a bottle of lemonade sweating in her hand. She was 17, floated where others stomped, and dressed in boots that looked like they had known a different life. She cut a path of her own through her father's empire with quiet defiance. Photos, sketchbooks, a collection of tiny wildflowers pressed in a notebook. She passed the barn doors and paused, seeing Ethan wiping down tack that wasn't his to polish. "You're new," she said, resting a wrist on the doorframe. He glanced up, startled. "Not new, just quiet." Grace smiled as if she knew what it was to live inside a careful word. "Quiet is underrated," she said, then tilted her head. "Is he really as bad as they say?" Ethan hesitated. Lying felt too heavy in his mouth, truth too dangerous. "He's scared," he said finally. Grace's eyes moved to the end stall, softened for a breath. Then she nodded once and kept walking. If she looked back, Ethan didn't see it. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of ripe peaches, and a wind came across the flats that smelled faintly of rain it wasn't bringing. Work ebbed toward chores that could be done by habit. Sam tried a new method on Shadow, hanging a saddle blanket on the stall's inner rail, then tapping the boards with the blunt end of a crop in a hard, rhythmic pattern. The horse's reaction was immediate and electric, a surge forward, a violent slam of shoulder to wood, a sound that made Ethan's teeth ache. "Damn it," Sam hissed, stepping back. "Stubborn." Richard appeared again, drawn by the noise, expression shuttered. "He learns," Richard said, but it sounded as though he were trying to convince himself. He looked at Ethan, at the rag in his hand, as if noticing him for the first time. His gaze caught on the quiet and misread it. "You, kitchen boy, you're in the wrong place." "Yes, sir," Ethan murmured. He folded the rag, tucked it into his back pocket, and walked away at a pace that didn't look like retreat. Evening spread over the ranch like a blanket shaken out on a line. Floodlights clicked on one by one, casting cones of white across the yard. In the kitchen, Nora sang along with an old Patsy Cline song under her breath while she scrubbed pots. Ethan dried and stacked, swept the corner where flour dust, gathered, carried out the trash. When the last plate was done, and the lights were dimmed to a soft amber, Nora tied her hair back and sat him at the small table, with a chipped blue book he'd found at a church sale, Charlotte's Web. They read whenever the day allowed, 1 page his, 1 page hers. She liked the sound of his voice better than the story, though she'd never admit it. "You've been thinking about that horse all day," she said when they closed the book. Ethan watched his finger trace the pattern in the wood. "He won't let them near because he knows what comes next." Nora's face pinched with worry. "Ethan, I won't do anything stupid," he said quickly. "I promise." She cupped his hands in both of hers and looked at him the way only a mother could, as if she could hold him back from cliffs with love alone. "I know the shape of your promises," she said, half smiling. "They walk you straight toward trouble." He kissed her cheek, the scent of soap and onions and peppermint tea clinging to her. "I'll be careful." The bunk room was loud, men laughing at jokes they had told each other 100 times. The television mumbled from the common room. Card decks slapped down like tiny thunder. Ethan lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until the noise blurred into a single, heavy sound. He waited. He listened to footsteps dwindle, faucets squeak and hush. The last cough, the last laugh. He waited until the ranch was a breathing thing asleep. When he slid from his bed, the night met him with cool fingers. The moon was new, just a wet shine along the edge of darkness, so the stars handled the work of light. He moved by memory, shadow to shadow, learning again that he could be part of the dark if he wanted. He knew which gate hinges squealed and which boards were true. Copper lifted his head and wagged once, but didn't bark, as if the dog understood secrets. The barn smelled of alfalfa and leather and the deep, warm note of horse. He paused at the door to let his eyes adjust. Motes turned slow revolutions in the beam from a high window. Somewhere a mare snorted and settled. In the far stall, something shifted, and there it was again, that quiet tug in his chest, the familiar ache of recognition. He slipped along the aisle, palm skimming the rail when he needed the reassurance of touch. At the end, he stopped in front of the stall that held Shadow. Up close, the boards looked scarred and tired, as if they had been asked to carry more fear than wood was meant to bear. He pressed his ear to the gap and heard breath. Fast, then measured, then fast again, like a runner forced to stand still. Ethan slid the latch with both hands, carefully, inch by inch, counting the small clicks in his head. The sound was loud in the quiet. He waited after each one, listening for the change on the other side. When the final bolt released, the door sighed against its track. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just made the smallest space between them possible. "Hey," he whispered, uncertain whether the word belonged to English or to something older. "You don't know me, but I know the feeling of 4 walls." For a long beat, nothing moved. Ethan kept his hands at his sides, empty and open. "I won't touch you," he said. "I won't ask you to do anything. I'll just sit." He slid down the outside of the door and tucked his knees against his chest, cheek on his arm, a boy folded small. He talked in a voice that barely stirred the air. Not about halters or rings or making anything obey, about quiet things. How Copper waited for his chance. How the rooster pretended not to need help. How the river below the cottonwoods could sound like a secret when the wind came the right way. How a hawk had once decided not to die where everyone said it would. Minutes passed in the way water moves, silently, with purpose. Inside the stall, hooves shifted, then stilled. Wood ticked as it cooled. A cricket tried a song and then thought better of it. Ethan told the horse his name, as if it were a gift instead of a request. "I'm Ethan," he said. "You can keep yours if you want. You don't have to be what they call you." There was a sound, softer than a sigh, deeper than a snort. Ethan let it pass through him. He didn't lift his head. He didn't dare. He knew what it cost a wild thing to consider a human voice without baring its teeth. When at last he looked up, he saw one dark eye at the narrow opening. Black on black. Starshine caught in it like a pin. The horse's breath washed over his face, warm and sweet with hay. Ethan didn't move more than a leaf might in a breeze. He raised his hand only an inch from his knee and left it there, palm facing the door. An invitation, not a command. Shadow stayed, then stepped. The sound of his hoof against packed dirt carried through the wood. A second step. Another. The eye filled the gap. Ethan felt a wild, helpless surge in his chest. Hope, fear, gratitude, all braided. "Easy," he whispered. "We're both here. That's enough." From the yard, a night bird called. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped at the sky. Ethan thought of his mother asleep with one hand on the book they'd left open, and of the man in the big house dreaming of cameras and applause. Between those two worlds, he sat at a door that was no longer fully closed, and listened as the horse on the other side began, for the first time, to breathe like he wasn't alone. The moon lifted itself over the Guadalupe Mountains, a pale coin pressed against a velvet sky. The ranch had quieted into a different kind of life, one built on the low hum of insects, the whisper of wind moving through dry grass, the occasional bark of a restless dog. In the barn, Ethan sat cross-legged outside the stall, his back against the rough wood, his eyes fixed on the gap through which Shadow's gaze shimmered like obsidian catching. Starlight. He had never felt time move the way it did now. Minutes stretched into something softer, like fabric drawn taut. He told the horse things he had never told another soul. That school felt like a place built for other people's sons, not for him. That he sometimes wished he could run fast enough to leave behind the smallness of his life. That his father had once promised to return, but had vanished into a horizon that never gave him back. Words tumbled out quietly, not in hope of answers, but because silence in company can be heavier than any noise. Inside the stall, Shadow's breathing slowed. At first, Ethan thought it was coincidence, but then the rhythm matched the lull of his own. The boy's chest rose, the horse's chest fell, until the difference between them narrowed. Ethan dared to stretch out his palm, hovering in the air, not touching the wood. A long minute passed, then two. And then, so slight he almost thought he'd dreamed it, warm breath slid against his skin. Shadow's muzzle, close enough to blur the edge between dream and truth. Ethan swallowed hard, every nerve lit. He didn't move. He let the warmth wash over him, let it settle into a part of him that had ached for belonging. "I won't hurt you," he whispered. "I won't let them either." The words floated into the dark, binding him to a promise no court would recognize, but one the boy intended to keep with every fiber of himself. Far across the yard, unseen, Grace Hale leaned her shoulder against a fence post, camera resting useless around her neck. She had wandered with the excuse of chasing night photographs, but what she saw through the gap in the barn door stopped her. A skinny boy in a hand-me-down shirt, sitting as if the earth itself had told him to be still, and a black Mustang that had nearly killed grown men now standing calm in his presence. Grace's hand tightened around the camera. For once, she didn't lift it. The moment felt too holy for glass and film. A board creaked. Ethan stiffened, head jerking toward the sound, but Shadow didn't bolt. Instead, the horse stamped once and lowered his head closer. Ethan's fear dissolved into something braver. "It's just the night," he murmured, more to Shadow than himself. "It can't touch us." Hours spilled like sand. Ethan talked until his voice grew hoarse, until even the horses in the other stalls dozed. He told Shadow about the river where he sometimes hid after school, about Copper, the dog who trusted him more than food, about the dream he'd once had of riding into the desert with no end in sight. Somewhere in the telling, his eyelids sagged. He fought it, but the warmth of Shadow's nearness folded over him like a blanket. He woke with a start when a draft swept through the barn. The door had shifted, moaning against its hinges. Beyond it, the horizon was bruised with the first hint of dawn. Ethan scrambled upright, heart pounding. He checked the latch he had loosened the night before. Somehow, miraculously, it was still in place, as if Shadow himself had chosen not to push further. The boy exhaled a shaky laugh. "You stayed," he said. "Guess you don't want to scare me off." Shadow snorted, tossing his mane. The sound was sharp, but not angry, more like agreement. Ethan grinned, a small, tired smile that felt like light finding a crack. By the time the ranch stirred awake, Ethan had slipped back to the kitchen. Nora found him scrubbing pans with unusual focus, his hair sticking up like a crow's nest. She noticed the red rims around his eyes and frowned. "You didn't sleep," she accused gently. "I did," he said too quickly. She didn't press, only handed him a biscuit and kissed his temple. "Be careful where you put your heart, Ethan. Some things are harder to keep than others." He bit into the biscuit, chewing slowly, his thoughts already drifting back to the barn. He couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. The boy who always felt invisible had been seen, not by people, but by a creature too wild to belong to anyone. And that mattered more than anything. Later that day, Sam stormed through the barn with his crop in hand, barking orders, muttering about stubborn animals and wasted time. He stopped at Shadow's stall, sneering at the horse as if insulted by its existence. Ethan, sweeping in the corner, felt his pulse quicken. He braced for the explosion, for Shadow's furious strike at the boards. But to his shock, the horse merely stepped back, ears twitching, muscles taut yet steady. Shadow's dark gaze flicked not at Sam, but toward the boy with the broom. Sam cursed and slammed the stall rail with the crop. Shadow flinched, but didn't erupt. Ethan tightened his grip on the broom handle, every instinct screaming to intervene, but he forced himself to stay silent. He knew Sam would notice if he showed too much. When the barn finally emptied, Ethan leaned against the rail, whispering under his breath. "You were strong. You didn't give him what he wanted." He could have sworn the horse's ears swiveled to catch the words. Night fell again, thick with crickets and the scent of mesquite. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every breath, every glance from that first night. He felt the promise burning brighter now, heavier, but not unbearable. He would go back. He had to. For Shadow, and maybe for himself. And in the barn, behind bolted wood and shadowed beams, the Mustang pawed once, then stood still, waiting. The evening sun bled red across the Texas sky when Richard Hale called for the barn doors to be left open. His boots clicked against the concrete floor as he entered, his presence enough to hush the chatter of ranch hands. Dust floated in shafts of fading light, catching on his pressed white shirt and the gleam of his silver belt buckle. Richard paused at the far stall, watching the restless black Mustang shift against the boards as if he could smell arrogance from a man the way other horses smelled fear. Shadow stomped, muscles quivering, mane falling over one dark eye. The horse had been tested for weeks, and every attempt had ended the same. Broken poles, bruised men, curses muttered into dirt. Richard's expression was carved from stone, but deep beneath it was the sour taste of humiliation. He had spent more on this horse than most men made in a year, and what did he have to show for it? A wild thing locked behind wood and steel. Sam Rodriguez leaned against a post, arms folded, his mouth curved into a sneer. "Boss, some animals don't know how to learn. You can throw every trick in the book, and they'll still spit in your face. Maybe time to cut your losses." Richard's eyes snapped toward him, icy and sharp. "I don't pay for losses, Sam. I pay for results." He let the words hang before turning, noticing the boy sweeping near the tack room. Ethan froze mid-motion, broom bristles whispering against the floor. His instinct was always to make himself smaller when Richard was near, but something about the man's gaze pinned him like a nail. "You," Richard said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "Kitchen boy, come here." The broom slipped from Ethan's hands as he shuffled forward, pulse thundering in his ears. He felt every eye in the barn on him, the men smirking, Sam's glare simmering with contempt. When he reached the stall, Richard crouched slightly, tilting his head as if appraising a colt at auction. "I've heard things," Richard said. "That horse doesn't kill you on sight, that you sit here at night talking like a fool and somehow he listens." Ethan's throat closed. He darted a glance toward Sam, whose lip curled, then back to Richard. His voice cracked. "I just don't scare him." The silence stretched until Richard chuckled low, shaking his head. "Don't scare him. Interesting way to put it." He straightened, smoothing his shirt. "You want to prove you're worth the space you take up here, boy? You're going to do what my men couldn't." Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Sir?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're going to break him. Tame him. Ride him before every guest I invite to this ranch next week. If you succeed, your mother keeps her job, and you both get a nice stack of bills to make your lives a little less pitiful." He paused, his tone dropping. "Fail, and you're both gone by morning. I won't feed mouths that don't earn their keep." The barn seemed to shrink around Ethan. He could feel the blood drain from his face, the broom still lying on the ground behind him like proof of his clumsiness. His voice cracked again. "I don't know how to—" "You'll learn," Richard interrupted sharply. "Or you'll lose. That's how this world works, boy. You take the hand you're dealt, and you play it hard, or someone else plays it. For you." Sam laughed under his breath, cruel and delighted. "This is madness," he muttered. "Putting a child in a stall with that demon." Richard silenced him with a glance that could freeze fire. "Madness is paying $200,000 for a horse that eats through my pride every day he's in that stall. If the boy can do it, then maybe he's not as worthless as the rest of you." The other hands exchanged glances, none daring to speak. Ethan's stomach twisted, but when he turned his eyes toward Shadow, he found the Mustang watching him. Ears flicked forward. In that gaze, fierce and unbroken, Ethan felt something stir. Not courage. Not yet. just a quiet understanding that this was the only way to protect the horse from the lash of Sam's whip and the greed in Richard's eyes. He forced himself to nod. "I'll try." Richard smiled thinly, as though sealing a contract. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, and flicked it at Ethan. It fluttered to the ground at the boy's feet. "Consider that your first day's pay. 5,000 more if you ride him in front of my guests. 50,000 if you make him look like mine." Ethan stared at the crumpled bill lying in the dust, his throat tight. That kind of money was beyond imagination, but he didn't bend to pick it up. Instead, he stepped back toward the stall, placing his palm against the wood. Inside, shadow shifted, the sound of his hooves sharp against the dirt. "Don't disappoint me," Richard said, his voice trailing behind him as he walked away. "You start tomorrow. And remember, if you're not strong enough, the world eats you alive." The barn emptied slowly, men muttering as they went. Sam lingered last, close enough that Ethan could smell the bite of tobacco on his breath. "You think you're special, don't you?" he hissed. "That horse will crush you, boy. And when he does, I'll be the one to throw you out the gate." Ethan said nothing. He kept his hand on the stall door until Sam's footsteps faded, his heart hammering in his chest. Shadow snorted softly, and Ethan closed his eyes. That night, when the ranch had gone quiet again, Ethan crept back to the barn. He slipped inside the stall for the first time, fear thick in his throat. Shadow stood in the corner, muscles coiled, eyes bright in the silver light. For a breathless moment, boy and Mustang measured each other. Then Ethan sank to the dirt floor, folding his legs, keeping his hands open and low. "I don't care about their money," he whispered. "I just don't want them to hurt you." Shadow pawed once at the ground, then stilled, his gaze fixed on the boy. Ethan sat there until the stars tilted across the sky, until exhaustion tugged at his eyelids. Somewhere in the silence, he realized he had crossed an invisible line. This wasn't just about saving himself or his mother anymore. It was about standing between this wild spirit and the world that wanted to cage it. By dawn, his decision was carved deep in his bones. He would keep Richard's bargain, but not for the reasons the man believed. He would try not to own Shadow, but to protect him. And in that promise, Ethan felt the first true flicker of courage take root. Morning came with a heat that clung to the skin before the sun had fully risen. The ranch stirred alive as trucks rumbled across gravel and men carried tack over their shoulders. The smell of hay and manure wrapped around the barns like an unshakable coat. Ethan stood in the doorway, his palms clammy despite the cool shadow at his back. Today, the bargain began. Sam Rodriguez was already inside, snapping orders with a voice as sharp as a whip. He paced like a soldier, inspecting his ranks, dark eyes scanning every movement. When he caught sight of Ethan lingering in the doorway, his mouth curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Well, look who's come to play cowboy. Thought you were better off behind a stove with your mama's pots." Ethan's chest tightened, but he forced himself forward, every step like walking against a strong wind. He didn't answer. Words with Sam never ended well. Silence was his only shield. "Don't just stand there," Sam barked. He shoved a heavy brush into Ethan's hand. "If you're going to waste Mr. Hale's time, at least look like you know what you're doing. Start with grooming, and don't expect him to thank you." Ethan took the brush, the weight of it heavy in his small hand. He approached the stall where Shadow waited, the boards thick with scratches from countless kicks. Sam leaned against a post, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled delight. The boy drew in a slow breath and opened the door. The moment Ethan stepped inside, the air changed. Shadow swung his head, ears flicked back, muscles tensed like wire. Dust rose under his hooves as he shifted his weight, a warning without sound. Ethan didn't back away. He lowered his gaze, shoulders loose, and spoke softly. Words meant more for rhythm than meaning. "It's just me, same as before. No ropes, no whip, just me." Sam snorted from outside. "He'll pin you against that wall in 2 seconds." But Shadow didn't. The horse eyed the brush in Ethan's hand, nostrils flaring. Ethan let it drop to the ground, the sound muffled against dirt. "Not yet," he whispered. "We'll wait." He crouched, folding himself small, his palms open on his knees. For a long stretch, nothing moved but the lazy spin of flies in the air. Then Shadow lowered his head, sniffed the brush, and snorted once before stepping back. Ethan picked it up slowly, careful not to break the fragile piece. He reached out, stopping inches from Shadow's flank, waiting. The horse's muscles rippled, but he didn't bolt. Ethan's hand moved in a slow stroke, bristles dragging through the sheen of black hair. Dust lifted in small clouds. The boy's chest eased. Outside, Sam's face hardened. He spat into the dirt and muttered, "Damn trick won't last." All morning, Ethan worked in silence, brushing, whispering, moving slowly along Shadow's side until the horse's breathing calmed. Sweat trickled down Ethan's neck, but he didn't mind. Each pass of the brush felt like a door opening. He didn't rush, didn't force. He let the horse decide when enough was enough. By midday, Richard himself appeared, his boots polished despite the dirt, his eyes calculating. Grace trailed behind him, camera in hand, snapping photos of wildflowers before turning her lens toward the stall. She lingered on Ethan, but Richard's gaze was fixed on Shadow. "Well?" Richard demanded, his voice slicing the heavy air. "Has the boy done more in a few hours than you did in weeks, Sam?" Sam's jaw tightened. "It's nothing, sir. Just a trick of calm. Wait till he tries a saddle." Richard studied the scene, Shadow standing calmer than anyone had ever seen him, and let out a small hum. "Maybe calm is the trick you fools forgot. Keep going, boy. I want to see results before the week is out." He turned sharply and strode away, Grace glancing once more at Ethan before following. Her eyes held something Sam's never did: curiosity, maybe even respect. Ethan bent back to his work, though his heart thudded with pressure. He had only days to turn this fragile beginning into something no one thought possible. The hours dragged into late afternoon. Sam hovered like a vulture, throwing in sharp remarks meant to shake Ethan's focus. "You're wasting time. You're coddling him. He's laughing at you, boy." Each word landed like a stone in Ethan's chest, but he kept his hand steady on Shadow's flank, brushing in long strokes, whispering whenever the horse twitched. At one point, Sam slammed a gate shut with deliberate force. The bang cracked through the barn, startling the other horses. Shadow jerked, reared back, and Ethan stumbled. Sam smirked. "See? That's what happens when you play gentle. He'll kill you without even trying." But Ethan didn't give in to fear. He steadied himself, breathing deep, and stepped forward again. Shadow's ears flicked, his body still tense, but when Ethan's voice returned, low and steady, the Mustang eased. Slowly, the storm in him settled again. By nightfall, Ethan's arms ached, his shirt clung with sweat, but Shadow stood calm beside him, eyes softer than anyone had seen. Ethan pressed his forehead lightly to the horse's neck, whispering, "We'll get through this. You and me." From the doorway, Sam watched, the lines of his face twisted with something darker than anger. Resentment, yes, but also fear. Fear that a boy with no whip, no rope, and no name worth mentioning was about to succeed where he had failed. And Sam Rodriguez was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. That night, as the sky swallowed the ranch in stars, Ethan lay awake in his bunk. Every muscle in his body throbbed, but his heart beat with a strange new rhythm. Hope. He didn't know how far it would carry him, but he knew one thing. Shadow had let him in. And for the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he might not be so invisible after all. The next days unfolded beneath a relentless Texas sun, each one heavy with heat and dust. Mornings began with the clatter of buckets and the bark of orders, but Ethan's world narrowed to the stall at the far end of the barn. Every hour he could spare belonged to Shadow. The other ranch hands mocked him, some with laughter, some with silence that carried its own cruelty. But he ignored them. All that mattered was the horse who had chosen not to destroy him. At first, Shadow was still a storm waiting to break. He paced the stall, ears pinned, eyes flashing whenever the boy entered. Ethan never rushed. He entered with his head lowered, voice soft, words tumbling into the air like water over stone. Sometimes he spoke about nothing at all. The smell of bread from the kitchen, the way the cottonwoods by the river whispered in the wind, the strange shapes of clouds above the mountains. Sometimes he confessed things even his mother didn't know, that he often felt like an outsider everywhere he went, that the silence of animals made more sense to him than the noise of people. Shadow listened, or at least he didn't turn away. By the third day, something shifted. Ethan carried a small book into the stall, its cover faded from years of use. Charlotte's Web. He had bought it for $1 at a church fair, and it was the only story he never tired of. He sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, his back against the wall, and read aloud. His voice trembled at first, but the rhythm of the words soon steadied him. Shadow, restless at the start, eventually settled, lowering his head until his breath warmed the boy's shoulder. Ethan read on, heart swelling at the impossible sight of a wild Mustang choosing stillness. When Nora discovered him that afternoon, bringing a tin plate of bread and beans, she stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. There was her son, sitting calmly beside the most dangerous horse on the ranch, reading as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Shadow's flank rose and fell with slow, even breaths. Ethan looked up and smiled faintly, a boy caught in something larger than himself. Nora wanted to call him out, to pull him away from danger, but pride tempered her fear. She simply set the plate on a hay bale and whispered, "Don't be too long." Word spread quickly. The hands who had cursed Shadow now stole glances at the stall, muttering under their breath about the boy's strange gift. Some scoffed that it was luck, that sooner or later the horse would crush him. Others, though, felt a reluctant awe. Even Sam, though he mocked louder than the rest, watched with a tight jaw, as though something in his chest twisted every time Shadow pressed, his muzzle against Ethan's arm. Grace came often, camera slung over her shoulder, though she rarely used it. She preferred to stand quiet, leaning against the rail, studying Ethan as though he were a subject more interesting than the horse. One evening, when the light turned golden and the dust sparkled like fireflies, she spoke. "You talk to him like he understands." Ethan glanced up, startled, then nodded. "He does. Not with words. But he knows." Grace tilted her head. "Maybe you're the one who knows. Most people don't listen." Her words stayed with him long after she left. By the 5th day, Ethan dared to guide Shadow from the stall into the corral. The men gathered at a distance, Sam front among them, smirking as if waiting for disaster. Ethan held no rope, no whip, only his voice and his steady hands. Shadow hesitated at the open door, hooves striking the threshold as if weighing freedom against fear. Ethan didn't push. He simply stepped aside and whispered, "It's your choice." The horse snorted, ears flicking, and then stepped out. The corral seemed to hold its breath as the black Mustang circled once, then twice, before returning to Ethan's side. Gasps rippled among the men. Sam spat into the dirt, but even his eyes betrayed a flicker of disbelief. Each day after, Ethan stretched the trust further. He brushed Shadow's coat until it gleamed like spilled ink beneath the sun. He led him with a rope draped loosely across his neck, not pulling, only guiding. He pressed his forehead to the scar hidden under Shadow's mane and whispered promises. That no one would force him again, that pain did not have to follow every touch. Shadow seemed to understand, his body relaxing in ways no one else had witnessed. Richard watched from the edge of the corral one evening, arms folded, eyes narrowed in thought. He didn't clap or cheer like the workers who gathered. He only studied, calculating. For Richard, this wasn't a miracle. It was an opportunity. If a scrawny boy could make the wild horse yield, then he could parade it before senators and oil men, proof that nothing was beyond his reach. Ethan, though, saw none of that. For him, each step Shadow took beside him was its own reward, a quiet victory whispered only between them. The quiet days built into something larger, a rhythm, a bond. Ethan stopped feeling invisible. Each dawn, he rose with a purpose, his hands steady, his heart tethered to a creature no one else could touch. The ranch, with all its noise and cruelty, faded to the edges. In the center stood a boy and a horse, bound by something neither could name, but both could feel. And though the world beyond the corral moved with the same greed and pride as always, within those quiet days, Ethan discovered a truth he had never known before. He was not powerless. He was not alone. For the first time in his life, he had been chosen. The ranch glowed with the hum of anticipation, though it was not the kind that bred excitement. It was the tight anticipation of something looming, a pressure that pressed against the ribs and stole the air. Every worker felt it. The gala was coming. The grand display Richard Hale had promised his powerful friends, and with it the expectation that the impossible would be made into a spectacle. All week, men had whispered about the boy and the horse, their disbelief shading into awe, their awe shading into envy. By now, even the desert wind seemed to carry the story, the cook's son, who had done what no wrangler could. Ethan felt it most of all. Each step he took through the barn carried the weight of what tomorrow would demand. Shadow followed him willingly now, his hooves soft against the packed dirt, his eyes calmer than anyone had ever seen. Yet trust was not the same as submission, and Ethan knew it. Shadow wasn't broken. He was choosing every moment to allow the boy close. That choice could vanish if fear returned. Ethan lay awake at night, wondering if the noise, the lights, the shouting men at the gala would shatter everything they had built. On the 7th day, Richard ordered Ethan to prepare Shadow for display. The stallion's coat gleamed after hours of brushing, the black hair reflecting gold in the late sun. Ethan laid a light blanket across his back, not a saddle, just enough to mimic the weight. Shadow tensed, muscles twitching beneath the fabric, and Ethan pressed his forehead gently to the horse's neck. "It's not forever," he whispered. "Just for tomorrow. Just to keep you safe." Slowly, Shadow eased, as though hearing the promise. Sam Rodriguez lingered in the doorway, his arms folded, a storm brewing in his eyes. He had grown quieter as the days passed, but not calmer. He watched the boy stroke the horse, saw the animal lean into that touch, and his lip curled. "A trick," he muttered under his breath. "All tricks fall apart." When Ethan glanced at him, Sam forced a grin too sharp to be kind. "We'll see if he listens when there's more than your mama to clap for you." That evening, Grace walked into the barn with her camera, though she didn't lift it. She simply stood beside Ethan, watching Shadow chew a slice of apple from his hand. The fading light painted everything honey gold, turning dust motes into sparks. Grace spoke quietly, almost as if afraid of breaking the spell. "Tomorrow's not about him, you know. It's about your father's pride. If anything goes wrong, he'll blame you." Ethan kept his eyes on Shadow, stroking his mane. "I don't care what he blames. I just don't want Shadow hurt." Grace tilted her head, studying him, then said softly, "You care more about that horse than yourself." Ethan finally met her gaze. "He's never had anyone care for him. If I don't, who will?" Grace didn't answer, but the camera strap slipped through her fingers as if the device had suddenly become useless. She left the barn without a word, though. Ethan felt her eyes on him long after she disappeared into the twilight. That night, Ethan returned to the stall long after the other workers had gone. The ranch was quiet, the house on the hill glowing with warm light as Richard entertained guests who had arrived early. Music drifted faintly across the fields, violins and laughter, and the clink of glasses. Ethan ignored it all. He slid into the stall and sat cross-legged beside Shadow, resting his hand on the Mustang's flank. He spoke in a voice low enough that only the horse could hear. "Tomorrow they'll want to see you as proof. Proof that money can buy anything. Proof that men can cage the wild. But you're not proof of anything. You're Shadow. You're more than what they see." His throat tightened. "If I fail you tomorrow, if it all goes wrong, I'm sorry. I swear I'll find a way to make it right." Shadow lowered his head until his muzzle brushed Ethan's hair. The boy closed his eyes and let the warmth steady him. Outside, coyotes yipped at the edge of the desert, their voices rising like a warning. Ethan stayed until his legs cramped and his eyes grew heavy, until the Mustang's breath slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Only then did he rise, his body stiff, his heart beating like a drum that would not quiet. As he left the barn, he glanced toward the house on the hill. Through the large windows he could see Richard moving among his guests, shaking hands, smiling with that polished mask he wore in boardrooms. Ethan felt the distance between their worlds as a canyon too wide to cross. Yet tomorrow they would be forced into the same ring, with the eyes of the powerful watching. He stepped into the night air, the scent of mesquite heavy on the wind. The stars blazed fierce above him, but instead of comfort, they felt like witnesses. Tomorrow, the world would decide whether he and Shadow were miracle or failure. And as Ethan walked back toward the small room he shared with his mother, he whispered into the darkness, not knowing if the horse or the night heard him. "Hold on with me, Shadow. Just one more day." The ranch had never looked so polished. By noon the next day, workers were hauling polished chairs under white canopies, laying out linen tablecloths, and stringing lights across the corral like stars captured for display. Trucks rolled in one after another, disgorging men in pressed suits and women whose jewelry glinted beneath the unforgiving Texas sun. Waiters carried trays of champagne through the dust, as though they were balancing glass in a ballroom. Richard Hale moved among them like a general inspecting troops. His smile was wide, his handshakes firm, but his eyes stayed sharp with calculation. Every detail had been chosen to send a message: wealth, control, triumph. And at the center of it all was the promise that the wild black Mustang, the horse no wrangler could tame, would finally bow to him before the most powerful men in the state. From behind the corral fence, Ethan watched the crowd gather. His shirt was clean, tucked too tightly into borrowed trousers, the collar stiff against his neck. His mother had pressed the clothes until they looked new, her hands trembling as she did. Now she stood near the kitchen tent, her face pale, her eyes flicking constantly toward him. Grace moved through the crowd with her camera, snapping pictures of senators laughing too loudly, of businessmen fanning themselves with programs. Every so often her lens lingered on Ethan, though he didn't notice. Shadow stood in the stall behind him, restless but not panicked, his ears twitching at the rising hum of voices. Ethan brushed him one last time, whispering steady words. "It's just noise, nothing more. You're stronger than them. You're free even when they don't see it." He breathed with the horse, in and out, until his own nerves steadied. A trumpet blast silenced the crowd. Richard strode into the center of the corral, his arms lifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice carrying above the desert wind, "welcome to Hale Ranch. You've come to witness proof that with patience, investment, and discipline, even the wildest spirit can be mastered." Polite applause rippled through the guests, though some leaned forward with skepticism. Richard's gaze swept the crowd, then cut toward Ethan. With a sharp nod, he summoned the boy forward. The world narrowed to the pounding of Ethan's heart. He opened the stall door, and Shadow stepped out, the sun igniting his black coat until it shimmered like liquid obsidian. Gasps escaped from the crowd. The Mustang was more magnificent than any polished show horse, more dangerous too. Ethan kept his hand light on the rope, guiding without pulling. Shadow followed, not because he was forced, but because he chose to. The difference was invisible to most, but Ethan felt it in his bones. The corral fell silent as the boy led the horse to the center. Ethan laid a blanket gently over Shadow's back. The stallion flicked his ears but stood steady. Slowly, Ethan placed one foot in the stirrup and swung himself onto Shadow's back. No saddle, no bit, no spurs, only trust. A collective gasp surged through the guests as the boy sat upright on the wild Mustang, hands resting lightly on his mane. For a moment, time held its breath. Then Ethan squeezed his knees softly, and Shadow began to walk. The crowd erupted into applause. Richard's smile gleamed like steel polished for battle. Ethan guided Shadow into a trot, then a smooth circle around the ring. The horse responded to every subtle shift of weight, turning, slowing, quickening, as though the boy and stallion shared one heartbeat. Cameras flashed. Voices cried out in astonishment. Grace lifted her camera, capturing the moment. Ethan's face calm, Shadow's muscles rippling beneath him, a boy and a beast moving as one. But as the cheers rose, Richard's hunger grew sharper. He raised his hand, commanding silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, "you have seen the impossible made real. But true mastery requires more than trust. It requires obedience. Watch now as this wild spirit becomes not just tamed, but conquered." He turned his gaze on Ethan. "Make him jump." The words struck like a lash. Ethan froze, his hands tightening in Shadow's mane. The horse shifted beneath him, sensing his unease. Ethan looked toward Richard, then at the polished wooden obstacle two workers dragged into the corral. It was small compared to what show horses leapt with ease, but Ethan's stomach knotted. He remembered the scar beneath Shadow's mane, the story written into his skin. A jump gone wrong, pain seared into memory. "No," Ethan said, his voice low but clear. Richard's face darkened. "Do it, boy. Show them." Ethan shook his head, every muscle trembling. "He's not ready. I won't hurt him for your pride." The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning in with interest at the defiance. Richard's smile vanished, his jaw tight. "You will obey," he hissed, "or you and your mother are finished." Ethan looked down at Shadow, whose ears flicked nervously, muscles coiling. He thought of his mother's tired hands, of Sam's cruel smirk, of Richard's promises of money and power, and then he thought of nights spent whispering to this horse, of trust earned inch by inch. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Shadow's neck, and whispered, "Not for them. Never for them." Straightening, he lifted his voice for all to hear. "I won't make him jump. He's not a trick. He's not yours. He's free." Gasps rippled through the guests. Richard's face burned crimson, his fists clenched. Sam's laughter rang harsh from the sidelines, but Shadow stood calm beneath the boy, his head lifted high, eyes gleaming with something untamed. The silence stretched until it snapped under the weight of whispers. Richard forced a brittle smile, bowing slightly to his guests. "My apologies," he said through gritted teeth. "It seems the boy is not yet ready. Enjoy the feast. There will be other entertainment." He turned away, but his eyes locked on Ethan, cold as steel. The promise in them was clear. Punishment would come. As the crowd drifted toward the tents, murmuring about the boy and the horse, Ethan slid down from Shadow's back. He pressed his cheek to the stallion's neck, whispering through the pounding in his chest. "We did right. Whatever comes, we did right." Shadow snorted softly, as if answering. But in the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Richard conferring with Sam, their faces shadowed with fury. And in that moment, the boy knew that the fight was only beginning. The ranch settled into uneasy silence after the gala, but beneath the quiet, tension coiled like barbed wire. Richard Hale's fury was not loud, not yet. It simmered beneath the surface, in the clipped way he spoke to his staff, in the way his smile vanished the moment his guests turned their backs. The spectacle had not gone as planned. Instead of glory, he had been handed humiliation. A boy who defied him in front of senators and magnates, a horse that refused to perform on command. Pride had been wounded, and for a man like Richard, wounded pride was more dangerous than open rage. Ethan felt the weight of it the moment the crowd dispersed. He had slipped down from Shadow's back, every nerve raw, and for a heartbeat he had thought perhaps the truth had landed. Perhaps someone among those fine men and women had understood. But as he watched them drift toward the buffet tables, their laughter returning, their eyes glittering with gossip rather than conviction, his hope cracked. To them, it was entertainment, nothing more. The boy and the horse had been a curiosity, a story to tell over brandy in some polished Houston office. Only Richard's gaze mattered now, and it burned hotter than the desert sun. That night, Ethan sat at the edge of his narrow bed, his mother's hands wrapping around his shoulders. Nora's voice trembled as she whispered, "What were you thinking, Ethan? You should have done what he asked." "I couldn't," Ethan said, his voice low but unshakable. "He would have remembered the pain. He would have never trusted me again." Tears filled her eyes, but pride mingled with fear. She kissed his hair, her lips salty with worry. "He'll punish us for this. Richard Hale doesn't forget a slight." And she was right. The next morning, the barn doors crashed open before dawn. Richard strode in, Sam at his shoulder, the air around them crackling with authority. Ethan, already brushing Shadow, froze at the sight of them. The horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring as though sensing the storm. Richard's voice cut through the air. "You embarrassed me, boy. Do you know what that means?" Ethan's heart hammered, but he stood his ground. "I was protecting him. He's not a showpiece." Sam barked out a laugh, the sound sharp as broken glass. "Hear that, boss? The kitchen boy thinks he knows better than the man who owns the horse." Richard's eyes narrowed. "That horse is mine. I paid for him. He'll do what I say when I say it. And so will you, if you value your place here." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. His voice trembled, but the words still came. "He doesn't belong to anyone." For a moment, silence reigned. Even the other horses seemed to hold their breath. Then Richard stepped closer, towering over the boy. His voice dropped to a growl. "Careful, son. You're not a hero. You're a stray dog who wandered into my yard, and I can kick you out just as easily." Shadow stamped the ground, ears back, his massive body tense as though he could feel the boy's fear. Ethan rested a hand on his neck, drawing courage from the warmth beneath his palm. "I won't hurt him for you," he said, quieter, now but no less certain. Sam's face twisted. He raised his crop and smacked it against the stall rail with a crack that split the morning stillness. Shadow reared back, eyes wide, hooves striking sparks against the floor. Ethan flinched, but didn't step away. Instead, he stood firm, whispering to the horse until the storm inside him slowed. Richard's jaw tightened. "Enough. If you won't obey, then you're nothing to me. Pack your things." Nora appeared in the doorway just in time to hear it. She gasped, rushing forward. "Please, Mr. Hale, he's just a boy. Don't turn us out. We've given everything to this ranch." Richard didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. "You've got until sunset." He turned and walked out, his polished boots leaving dust swirling in his wake. Sam lingered, leaning close enough for Ethan to smell the bitterness on his breath. "Told you," he sneered. "That horse will cost you everything." When the barn emptied, Ethan pressed his face against Shadow's neck, tears hot against his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but I couldn't let them use you." The horse blew a soft breath against his shoulder, as if forgiving him. The rest of the day dragged like a slow march toward doom. Workers avoided Ethan's eyes, some with pity, some with relief that it wasn't them. Grace found him near the paddock, her camera swinging uselessly at her side. "You stood up to him," she said, her voice hushed. "No one does that." "It doesn't matter," Ethan muttered. "We'll be gone by tonight." Grace's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but they'll remember what you said." "I will." She walked away, but the look in her eyes lingered with him, a small flicker of hope against the dark. When the sun finally dipped low, painting the ranch in fire, Ethan packed the little he owned. A worn book, a threadbare blanket, the photograph of his father before he disappeared. Nora folded her apron with trembling hands, her face pale with defeat. "We'll find work somewhere," she whispered, though her voice shook. "We always do." Ethan nodded, but his gaze drifted back to the barn, to the stall where Shadow stood waiting. He felt the horse's eyes on him even from across the yard. A choice was coming, heavy as thunder. Richard Hale thought the story was finished, but deep in Ethan's chest, a new chapter was beginning, one that neither pride nor money could write for him. The sun fell behind the Guadalupe peaks, leaving the ranch washed in a dusky glow. Lanterns flickered on the porch of the big house, their light casting long shadows across the yard. In the bunkhouse, laughter spilled through the windows as the workers dealt cards and traded stories. The noise sounded almost mocking to Ethan as he sat in his small room, folding and unfolding the same worn photograph of his father. His mother sat across from him, her hands twisted together in her lap. Every line on her face carried the weight of the day. "Tomorrow we'll be gone," Nora said finally, her voice strained. "We'll walk away with our heads high. That's all we can do." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And leave Shadow to Sam and Mr. Hale? Leave him to the whip? To the auction block?" He shook his head, fierce in a way that startled even himself. "I can't, Mama. He trusted me. If I go, I'll be betraying him." Nora reached for him, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "You're just a boy. You can't fight men like Richard Hale." "I'm not fighting him," Ethan whispered. "I'm saving Shadow." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of the old bed frame when Nora sank down beside him. Her eyes shone with both fear and pride. "If you do this, there's no turning back. They'll chase us, Ethan." "I know," he said, "but we'll be running together. That's better than leaving him behind." Later that night, when the ranch had sunk into sleep, Ethan crept from the room. The desert air wrapped him in its cool embrace, carrying the faint smell of mesquite and dust. Copper, the red-eared mutt, lifted his head from where he lay near the fence, but made no sound. The dog's eyes followed him with a kind of quiet loyalty, as if recognizing the weight of the mission. Ethan crouched and stroked his fur once, whispering, "Keep watch for me." The barn loomed ahead, dark and silent. Ethan slipped inside, heart hammering. Shadow shifted in his stall, ears flicking as though he had been waiting. The boy hurried to him, pressing his face against the horse's warm flank. "Tonight," he breathed. "We're leaving tonight." He pulled from his pocket a small knife, the blade dulled from years of kitchen use. With it, he began sawing through the thick ropes and straps that Sam had used to reinforce the stall. Each cut felt like an act of defiance, like tearing through Richard's pride one strand at a time. Sweat gathered on his forehead, trickling into his eyes, but he didn't stop. Shadow stood unnervingly still, watching him with dark, steady eyes. A noise startled him. A creak outside, the crunch of gravel under boots. Ethan froze, holding his breath. Through a crack in the barn wall, he saw the faint glow of a cigarette. Sam. The man leaned against a post, the ember burning like a predator's eye in the night. Ethan pressed himself against the wood, praying the man wouldn't come inside. Minutes dragged. Finally, Sam flicked the cigarette into the dirt and wandered toward the bunkhouse, his silhouette swallowed by the dark. Ethan exhaled shakily, his body trembling. He turned back to the ropes, working faster now. When the last one gave, Shadow tossed his head, mane rippling like midnight waves. Ethan opened the stall door, and the horse stepped out, muscles rippling under his black coat. For a moment, boy and Mustang stood face to face in the dim barn light, equals bound by a promise only they understood. Nora appeared at the doorway, clutching a small bundle of food and a rolled blanket. Her face was pale, but her voice was firm. "If we're doing this, we do it now." They led Shadow from the barn, careful to avoid the main yard. The horse moved quietly, almost as if he understood the need for silence. Ethan guided him toward the cottonwoods near the river, where the brush grew thick enough to hide their passage. Each step away from the corral felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The ranch behind them slumbered in ignorance, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last. When morning came, Richard's wrath would descend like fire. Sam would hunt them with dogs, and the desert would offer little mercy. But Ethan didn't care. The night was theirs. They reached the edge of the property, where the dirt road wound toward the mountains. Ethan paused, pressing his hand against Shadow's neck. The horse blew a warm breath into the cool night air, his eyes glinting under the stars. "This is it," Ethan whispered. "From here, there's no cage, no whip, no master. Just the trail and us." Nora tightened her shawl around her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously toward the horizon. "Then let's go before the dawn finds us." Ethan climbed onto Shadow's back, bare legs pressed against the Mustang's sides, while his mother walked beside them. The three of them moved together, a fragile caravan bound by desperation and hope. Behind them, Hale Ranch faded into shadow, the glow of the big house shrinking until it was nothing but a memory. And ahead, the open desert stretched vast and silent, waiting to test how far a boy, a mother, and a wild black horse could go, when freedom was the only thing worth risking everything for. The desert night was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft crunch of hooves against dirt and the rasp of Nora's breathing as she hurried beside her son. Shadow moved like a shadow himself, gliding between mesquite trees and cottonwoods with uncanny grace. The moon rode high, silvering the vast landscape, but Ethan felt every rustle of leaves as a threat, every distant howl of coyotes as a warning. He knew the ranch would not sleep forever. When Richard discovered their absence, the hunt would begin. They kept to the dry creek bed at first, the ground soft and muted underfoot. Copper, the red-eared mutt, had followed them despite Ethan's whispered pleas to stay behind. Now he trotted ahead, ears pricked, tail low, as if guiding them into the wilderness. Nora carried the small bundle of food tight against her chest, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Ethan sat astride Shadow, with no reins, only his knees and his whispers to guide the Mustang. The horse obeyed, not out of training but out of trust. As they climbed a ridge beyond the river, the ranch lights dwindled into pinpricks. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. He leaned down against Shadow's neck, inhaling the warm, earthy scent of him. "We did it," he whispered. "We're free." But freedom was not so easily won. Hours later, as dawn began to bruise the horizon, the distant growl of engines reached their ears. Ethan froze, his stomach turning cold. Behind them, along the dirt road, a convoy of trucks bounced in the pale light. Headlamps cut through the dark like knives. Even at this distance, the sound of men shouting carried on the wind. "They're coming!" Nora gasped, clutching Ethan's leg. Shadow tossed his head, sensing the tension. Ethan pressed his palm to the horse's neck, steadying him. "We can outrun them," he said, though the words were more hope than certainty. They veered off the trail, plunging into thicker brush. Branches tore at Nora's shawl, whipped across Ethan's arms, but Shadow pressed forward, muscles coiled with power. Copper darted alongside, weaving through sage and cactus. Behind them, the dogs began to bay, sharp, furious cries that pierced the desert air. Sam's voice carried faintly, hard and cruel. "Find them! Don't let that brat take the horse!" Fear knifed through Ethan, but adrenaline steadied his grip. He guided Shadow up a rocky incline, the Mustang's hooves striking sparks on stone. Dust rose behind them, covering their trail for a moment. At the crest, Ethan glanced back. The trucks were closer now, bouncing over the uneven ground, the headlights glaring like eyes. Men spilled from the beds with rifles slung across their shoulders. The hunt had become war. They pushed deeper into the mountains, the path narrowing into a canyon where walls of sandstone loomed on either side. The air smelled of sage and stone, the sky narrowing above them. Ethan knew they were trading one danger for another. In the canyon, there would be no room to hide. If the men caught them here, there would be no escape. Shadow slowed as the path steepened, sweat glistening along his black coat. Ethan leaned forward, whispering encouragement, urging him on. Nora stumbled, but kept pace, her determination fierce despite her exhaustion. Copper barked suddenly, his hackles raised. A split second later, the canyon walls echoed with the sharp crack of a rifle. The bullet struck stone above them, showering sparks. Nora cried out, ducking instinctively. "They're shooting!" she gasped. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "Faster, Shadow!" The Mustang surged forward, hooves pounding the canyon floor. The sound of pursuit grew louder, voices echoing off the stone, dogs snarling as they closed in. At last, the canyon split into two trails, one broad and sloping downward, the other narrow and jagged, winding upward into the cliffs. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled Shadow toward the high path, away from the trucks and the dogs. The climb was brutal, the rocks slick, but the higher ground might give them a chance. They scrambled up the switchbacks, loose stones, rattling down the slope. Ethan dared another glance behind. The men were splitting as well, some following in trucks along the wide trail, others on foot climbing after them. Sam was among the climbers, his dark hat pulled low, his crop now replaced by a rifle. The chase blurred into sweat and dust and pounding hearts. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed, but Shadow never faltered. The horse climbed as though the mountain itself had shaped him for this. At the top, the trail opened onto a narrow plateau overlooking the valley. From here, the desert stretched endless, the horizon painted gold by the rising sun. Nora collapsed against a boulder, her face pale. "We can't keep this up," she gasped. "They'll run us down." Ethan slid from Shadow's back, gripping the horse's mane as if drawing strength. He looked out at the valley, then back at the path they had climbed. The shouts of their pursuers echoed closer, Sam's voice loudest among them. "We have to," Ethan said fiercely. "There's no going back." Shadow snorted, stamping the ground, his black coat shimmering with sweat and sunlight. Ethan laid a hand against the horse's neck and whispered, "It's you and me now. They'll never understand, but we do." The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the hunters closing in. Nora's eyes widened with fear, Copper growled low in his throat, and the boy knew their time was nearly gone. He swung back onto Shadow's back, his gaze hard as the stone beneath them. "Then we ride," Ethan said, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "As far as it takes, until they can't find us." And with a fierce cry, he urged Shadow forward, the Mustang leaping into motion. The ground shook beneath his hooves as they thundered across the plateau, the boy, his mother, and the wild horse carried by the raw, desperate strength of freedom itself. The plateau stretched wide beneath the rising sun, its surface scattered with scrub and sharp stone. Beyond it, the land fell away into a sheer canyon, a gash in the earth so deep the river below shimmered like a silver thread. Ethan felt the immensity of it the moment Shadow's hooves struck the edge of the plateau. Wind tore across the open space, carrying the cries of hawks that circled above. It was beautiful, but it was also a trap. The world had run out of paths. Behind them, shouts rang closer, bouncing off the canyon walls. Men appeared along the trail they had climbed, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces grim in the sunlight. Sam was in front, his dark hat pulled low, his voice carrying above the others. "You can't outrun us, boy! That horse is coming back with me!" Ethan twisted in the saddle, his heart hammering, his arms locked tight around Shadow's neck. Nora clung to the boy's leg, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled across the plateau. Copper growled at her side, hackles raised as if ready to face the rifles alone. Shadow pawed at the ground, muscles bunching beneath his black coat, nostrils flaring. He knew danger was near, the air thick with it, but he didn't bolt. He turned his head slightly, one dark eye catching Ethan's, waiting for a decision. "There's nowhere left to run," Nora gasped, her voice cracked with terror. "Ethan, we're trapped." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He looked at the canyon ahead, the drop too far, too deadly. Behind, the men closed in, their boots crunching, rifles glinting. Richard Hale himself had joined them now, his polished boots caked with dust, his face red with fury. He raised his voice, rich and commanding, echoing across the plateau. "Enough of this foolishness," Richard roared. "Bring me the horse, and bring me the boy if he won't let go!" Sam lifted his rifle, aiming straight for Shadow's flank. "Step aside, kid. Last chance." Time seemed to still. Ethan felt the blood pound in his ears, the roar of the wind filling his skull. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Shadow's mane. "They'll never understand," he whispered, his voice shaking. "But I do. It's your choice, Shadow. Not theirs. Not mine. Yours." The horse quivered beneath him, ears twitching, tail lashing like a whip. The men shouted again, voices sharp, urging Sam to fire. Nora cried out, reaching for her son. Ethan closed his eyes. Then Shadow reared. The stallion's front hooves struck the air, his body towering against the sky, a silhouette of black fire. His cry split the morning like thunder, raw and wild, the sound of something that could not be owned. The men faltered, some stumbling back, rifles lowering instinctively. Even Sam froze, his finger trembling against the trigger. Shadow came down hard, then turned in a sudden surge of power. Ethan clung tight as the Mustang bolted, not toward the men, not toward the open trail, but straight toward the edge of the canyon. Nora screamed, her voice tearing against the wind. Copper barked furiously, racing after them. The ground fell away, stone crumbling beneath Shadow's hooves. For a breathless instant, boy and horse hung suspended between earth and sky, the canyon yawning wide below. Then, with a leap born of desperation and trust, Shadow launched across the gap. The air roared in Ethan's ears. His heart seemed to stop as they sailed over the void. Nothing beneath them but space and the glitter of the river far below. Time stretched, endless, until Shadow's hooves struck the opposite ledge. Stone shuddered, pebbles skittering into the abyss. The Mustang landed, legs trembling but strong, and surged forward onto solid ground. Gasps erupted from across the canyon. The men stared in disbelief, their rifles forgotten. Sam's face twisted with rage, but even he lowered his weapon, as though some primitive part of him had been silenced by what he had witnessed. Richard stood motionless, his fists clenched, his expression caught between fury and awe. Ethan turned in the saddle, his chest heaving. Across the gap, the pursuers were stranded, the canyon too wide for their horses, too deadly for their trucks. For the first time, the boy felt something like triumph. He raised his voice, carrying it across the chasm. "You can't take him. He's not yours. He'll never be yours." The wind ripped the words into the sky, scattering them like seeds. Richard's face darkened, but he did not answer. He could not. Shadow snorted, tossing his head high, mane whipping like a banner of freedom. Ethan pressed his cheek against the horse's neck, tears stinging his eyes. "We made it," he whispered. "You chose." Behind him, Nora stumbled to the edge of the canyon, her knees nearly giving way when she saw the distance her son and the Mustang had leapt. Copper whined at her feet, tail wagging in anxious relief. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the canyon walls. On one side stood power, money, and pride, stranded by their own weight. On the other, a boy, his mother, and a wild black horse, carried forward by trust, stronger than chains. And for the first time since it all began, Ethan believed they might truly outrun the world that wanted to own them. The air on the far side of the canyon was sharper, colder, as though the leap itself had carried them into another world. Ethan still clung to Shadow's mane, his body trembling with the echo of what they had just done. Behind him, Nora staggered along the ledge, her hands pressed to her chest, eyes wide with shock. Copper barked once, high and sharp, his tail wagging as if to say he too could hardly believe it. Across the canyon, Richard and his men gathered near the edge, their figures stark against the rising sun. Their voices carried thinly on the wind, curses and disbelief tumbling into the void. Sam was among them, his rifle still gripped in white knuckles, his face dark with rage. He shouted something Ethan couldn't hear, but the fury in his posture was clear. Richard raised his hand, silencing the chaos. For a long moment he stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the boy and the horse that had defied him. Then he spoke, his voice booming across the canyon. "You think this is over, boy? That horse is mine. You can't hide in those mountains forever." Ethan lifted his chin, the words spilling out before fear could silence him. "He was never yours. Not for a price, not for a cage. He doesn't belong to anyone." A murmur rippled through the men on Richard's side. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though the truth in the boy's voice had unsettled them. But Sam barked a laugh, sharp and cruel, raising his rifle as if to prove ownership with bullets. Before he could aim, Shadow reared, striking the air with his hooves, his cry ripping across the canyon like a battle horn. The sound made even hardened men falter, stepping back instinctively from the edge. Nora reached up, clutching Ethan's leg where he sat astride the horse. "Don't provoke them," she pleaded. "They'll find another way across. They'll keep coming." Ethan looked down at her, then back at Richard, whose polished shoes were coated in dust, his fine suit ruined by the wilderness. For the first time, Ethan saw not a king, but a man undone, stripped of the control he worshipped. Yet he also knew men like Richard never surrendered easily. The boy guided Shadow a few steps forward until they stood at the very edge of the precipice. He raised his voice, letting it carry strong and clear. "You can't own a spirit. You can only honor it. And if you can't understand that, then you'll never touch him again." For a heartbeat, silence blanketed the canyon. Even the wind seemed to pause. Richard's face hardened like stone, his eyes narrowing to slits. Sam snarled, shaking with fury, but none of the men moved closer to the edge. The gap was too wide, too final. Shadow pawed the ground, his body gleaming with sweat and sunlight, his mane whipping wild in the wind. He turned his head, nudging Ethan's knee with his muzzle, as though urging him onward. Ethan nodded, tears burning his eyes. "We're not theirs," he whispered to the horse. "Not now, not ever." Behind them, the mountains stretched endless, peaks rising like sentinels, valleys winding into mystery. Danger still lurked there, rough terrain, hunger, the promise of pursuit. But at this moment, standing above the abyss with the enemy stranded on the far side, Ethan felt a surge of strength greater than fear. Richard finally lowered his arm, his voice quieter now, though no less venomous. "Run then. Run until you break. But remember, everything can be bought, even freedom." The words carried like poison, but Ethan answered with none. Instead, he pressed his heels lightly to Shadow's sides. The Mustang leapt forward, galloping along the plateau's edge, his cry echoing like thunder rolling across the desert. Nora and Copper followed as best they could, their figures small against the immensity of the wild. The men on the far side shouted again, their voices fading with distance. Richard's fury hung in the air, but it could not cross the canyon. For now, the boy and the Mustang had won. Ethan leaned low over Shadow's neck, the horse's mane whipping against his cheek. "They'll never break us," he whispered. "Not while we ride together." And as the canyon fell away behind them, the chase gave way to something else. A moment of defiance carved into the earth itself, where a boy, a mother, and a wild black horse stood unbroken against a world that believed everything had a price. The mountains held them in silence, a silence so vast it felt like the sky itself had swallowed their voices. Ethan guided Shadow along a narrow trail that wound between towering cliffs, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. Nora stumbled beside him, her shawl torn, her steps unsteady from the endless climb. Copper padded, faithfully at her heels, tongue lolling, tail twitching at every rustle in the brush. They had outrun Richard's men, but the weight of the pursuit clung to them still. Ethan's body ached, his legs raw from days of bareback riding, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. Shadow moved beneath him like a creature born of the wind, each stride steady, each breath deep and strong. The boy leaned forward, pressing his cheek against the horse's mane, whispering, "We're safe, Shadow. We made it this far." Yet he knew safety was fragile, as fleeting as the morning mist. They stopped by a spring that bubbled from the rock, its water cold and clear. Nora knelt to drink, her hands trembling as she cupped the stream. Ethan slid from Shadow's back, letting the Mustang lower his head to the water. For a long while, they stayed there, drinking, breathing, listening to the hush of the wilderness. The land itself seemed to cradle them, offering a respite from the chase. As the day stretched, they wandered deeper into the high country, where mesas opened to sweeping valleys and the sky seemed impossibly close. It was there they encountered others, riders who moved with the ease of generations across the land, their faces weathered by sun and time, their clothes marked by the dust of trails. A man at their front reined in his horse, studying the boy and the Mustang with dark, thoughtful eyes. "Lost travelers," he said, his voice low, carrying the cadence of the land itself. "Or fugitives?" Ethan's throat tightened, but Nora stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "We're only trying to survive." The man's gaze drifted to Shadow, who stood proud, his black coat gleaming in the light. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "That is no ordinary horse," he murmured. "That one carries the fire of the old Mustangs, the kind that do not yield." Ethan met his gaze, his heart pounding. "He's my friend. They tried to take him. We couldn't let them." The man studied him for a long moment, then dismounted. His companions watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Slowly, he approached Shadow, stopping a respectful distance away. The Mustang's ears flicked, his body taut, but he didn't bolt. The man inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging an equal. "He trusts you," he said at last. "That is rare. Most men would break a horse like this. But you have chosen another path." Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't choose it. He did." The man's eyes softened. "Then perhaps he has chosen well." They were invited to camp that night beneath the stars. Fires flickered against the canyon walls, and the smell of roasting meat mingled with the crisp mountain air. Nora sat among the women, her face gentler now, her shoulders easing as she shared food and quiet conversation. Ethan sat with the riders, listening to their stories of the land, of the old ways when wild herds roamed free and men measured their worth not in money but in respect for what could not be owned. One of the elders leaned toward him, her voice like wind through cedar. "You cannot keep him," she said, nodding toward Shadow, who stood at the edge of the firelight. "Not forever. He is not meant for chains, even chains of love. The wild is his home." Ethan's chest ached at the words, but he didn't argue. He knew it was true. Shadow's freedom was not a gift Ethan could give. It was the Mustang's birthright. Yet the thought of letting go carved a hollow place inside him. Later, when the fire had burned low and the camp had fallen quiet, Ethan lay awake beneath a sky spilling with stars. Shadow grazed nearby, his silhouette black against the silvered grass. Nora slept soundly for the first time in days, her face softened by dreams. Copper snored lightly at Ethan's side. The boy rose and walked to the Mustang, laying a hand against his warm flank. "They're right," he whispered. "You don't belong to me. You belong to the sky, to the wind, to the herd that's waiting out there somewhere. But, for now, can you stay? Just until we're safe?" Shadow lifted his head, dark eyes catching the starlight. He breathed out, a sound soft and steady, and lowered his muzzle until it brushed the boy's shoulder. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the contact steady him. Across the canyon, far beyond the reach of firelight, Richard Hale sat in the back of a truck, his suit discarded, his pride smoldering like coal. Sam stood beside him, maps spread across the hood. "They can't hide forever," Sam growled. "We'll smoke them out." Richard's eyes gleamed in the dark. "No," he said coldly. "We'll wait. Let the boy think he's won. The wild always breaks eventually, and when it does, that horse will be mine again." But on the other side of the wilderness, Ethan held fast to Shadow, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, and knew the truth Richard would never understand. Some spirits did not break. They awakened. And once awakened, they could never be chained again. The night sky stretched wide and endless above the mountains, a black ocean scattered with stars so fierce they seemed to hum. Ethan lay awake on the hard ground, staring upward, unable to sleep. Every muscle in his body ached from the days of riding and running, but his mind would not rest. Tomorrow was uncertain, and the thought pressed heavy on his chest. Shadow grazed nearby, a dark silhouette against the silver grass, his mane lifted by the cool wind. Nora stirred in her blanket, her face softened by firelight. Copper slept curled at her side, occasionally twitching his paws in some dream of pursuit. The camp of riders who had offered them food and shelter lay quiet, their fires glowing low, their figures shadows beneath the cedar trees. For the first time in many nights, Ethan felt a fragile calm, a stillness that reached deeper than exhaustion. He rose and walked toward Shadow, each step slow, his bare feet brushing against the cool earth. The Mustang lifted his head at once, ears flicking forward. Ethan stopped in front of him, pressing his small hand against the warm curve of his neck. "We're almost there," he whispered. "Almost free." Shadow breathed out, the sound heavy and steady, his breath misting in the cold. His dark eyes reflected the starlight, ancient and endless. Ethan leaned his forehead against him, feeling the thrum of life, the heartbeat that had carried them both across canyons and deserts. Behind them, the wind carried faint sounds, distant, almost imagined. Voices, engines. The hunt had not ended. Richard's men were still searching. Ethan's stomach tightened, but he pushed the fear aside. They couldn't run forever. The earth was too wide, and yet not wide enough when men wanted to claim what was never theirs. The next day dawned with a brittle chill. The riders offered them food, thick bread, and strips of dried meat. Nora's eyes shone with gratitude, though her hands trembled as she packed their bundle. Ethan noticed the way the riders spoke in low tones, glancing toward the horizon. They knew pursuit still lingered. Before they left, the elder woman who had spoken to Ethan the night before placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, child," she said, her voice rough but kind. "The wild is not yours to keep. It is yours to protect, for as long as you walk beside it." Ethan nodded, though his throat was too tight for words. They set out again, moving higher into the mountains, where the land spread open like a cathedral of stone and sky. The air smelled of sage and pine, and every sound seemed magnified, the wing beat of hawks, the rustle of brush, the rhythmic pound of Shadow's hooves. Nora walked beside them, slower now, but her eyes carried determination. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast valley. And there, at the far edge of the grassland, Ethan saw them. A herd of wild mustangs, manes streaming like banners, their bodies gleaming in the sunlight. They moved together in perfect rhythm, free and fierce, as though the earth itself had shaped them from wind and fire. Shadow froze, his ears sharp, his body trembling with recognition. A low whinny escaped him, deep and longing. Ethan's chest ached at the sound. He tightened his grip on the horse's mane, but his heart knew the truth before his mind could admit it. Nora touched his arm, her eyes soft with sorrow. "He's found his own," she whispered. "You can't hold him, Ethan." The boy's eyes blurred with tears, but he nodded. His voice cracked as he leaned close to Shadow's ear. "You don't need me anymore, not like before. Go. Be what you were meant to be." For a moment, Shadow did not move. He stood still, his breath warm against the boy's skin, his presence solid and familiar. Then, with a sudden surge, he tore across the grass, hooves striking sparks against stone. Ethan watched, heart breaking and swelling at once, as Shadow thundered into the valley. The herd lifted their heads, then surged to meet him, their cries echoing like music. And in a storm of dust and sunlight, Shadow was no longer alone. Ethan fell to his knees, sobs racking his chest. Nora wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. "You gave him back to the wild," she whispered. "That's love, Ethan. That's freedom." Across the valley, Shadow turned once, his mane whipping in the wind, his dark eyes fixed on the boy. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then he whinnied, loud and fierce, before vanishing into the gallop of the herd. As the dust settled, Ethan lifted his face to the sky. The stars of the previous night still seemed to burn in his memory, eternal and untouchable. He wiped his tears, his voice breaking as he whispered into the wind, "Some spirits are too wild to be owned. They can only be honored." Nora held him tighter, copper pressing against his side. The valley stretched wide before them, endless and unbroken. Though Shadow was gone, the boy knew he had not lost him. He had become part of something larger, something the world could never cage. And under the Texas sky, fierce with sunlight and promise, Ethan understood what freedom truly meant, not just for the Mustang, but for himself. And that's the story of a boy who chose freedom over fear, and a wild horse too proud to ever be owned. If this tale touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'd love to see how many of you felt the same. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bond between humans and animals you'll never forget.